say
Colossians 3:8. And who will get Ephesians 5, verse 4?
I got it.
Wonderful, thank you.
Ephesians 5:4, right?
Yeah, just a sec. I want to put a wrap on commandment number 3. All right. Commandment number 1. You shall... You're supposed to say what it is right now. You shall have
No
no other gods
before
before me. Yes. Commandment number 2. You shall not make graven image, idol. Yeah, you don't worship God through images. And number 3, you shall not take the Lord's name in vain. Say the name of the Lord, thy God, in vain, depending on what translation you're looking at. Yeah. You don't misuse God's name. And so we talked a lot about that last week, and we didn't quite get to finish up, so I want to finish with this last part. What does Colossians 3:8 say? Oh, I have a question for you guys. We talked about the term profanity. It's a Latin term. What does it mean? Profanity, you remember that? It literally is a compound word that means...
Didn't have to do something like with the temple or
yes,
something like that?
outside
the temple.
the
Or
temple.
outside the temple.
Yeah, yeah. Anything that's not fit to be in the temple is profane, and that's where our English word profanity comes from. It's stuff that just doesn't belong in the temple, or it's irreverent, I guess, which is kind of funny. So we talked a lot about misusing God's name and the ways that's done, and it's a lot more than just talking or carelessly talking. There are so many other things that dishonor God's name too. But we didn't really talk about what I believe is, this is an opinion of mine, I believe this is the purpose of speech. Go ahead and read Colossians 3:8, and then we'll read Ephesians 5:4, because these are parallel letters, and so they should sound similar.
All right, Colossians 3:8.
Yes.
But now you must rid yourself of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips.
Excellent. Get rid of filthy language. What does Ephesians 5:4 say?
Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, or cruel joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving.
Okay, so does God, even under the new covenant, care about what we say?
Yes.
Yeah, apparently he does. Apparently he does. Now, I believe it's Ephesians 4:29. He has more to say about this. Are you right there, Parker? Can you Ephesians what? 4:29. Does that say something about speaking?
Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as good for building up, such things that are good for building up, as fits for the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear it.
Spelling things. Building up. All right, so let no unwholesome talk come from your mouth, except that which is good for building others up. What does it say? It fits the occasion.
Yeah. Building each other up fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear it.
Grace. Another translation there would say benefit those who hear. I believe that verse actually has the purpose of speech. This is just my opinion here. What is the purpose of speech? Well, obviously it's to communicate. We use it for that. But there are other ways to communicate than just speaking. Right. I communicated something just there. So, but what should speech be? Well, something that builds others up. It fits or benefits the occasion. And it benefits the people who hear it. So everything you say, I believe, should either be informative to the occasion, it should be something that builds others up, or in some way benefit those who hear it. And anything that doesn't do that, I don't think you need to say it. Can you think of anything that you need to say that doesn't accomplish in some way, shape, or form one of these things?
Warning.
What's that?
Warning.
If you
Well, that
warn
would be a
someone, does
benefit.
that benefit them?
Yeah.
I hope it does,
Yeah.
yeah. I've sat and thought about this for a while. I can't think of anything, but you might. So I personally think Ephesians 4:29 is your go-to verse. What that says is the purpose of speech. And if whatever you want to say doesn't fit with that verse, then you probably don't need to say it. Simple as that, right? A lot of times we talk about speaking as negative. Christians are known for that. Don't say this, don't say that. That's bad word, bad word, bad word. Don't say that. But a lot of times we don't think about, well, what should you say? You know, what is the positive of this? Well, there we go. Stuff that builds people up, fits the occasion, and it benefits others. So, there you go. All right, that covers commandment number 3. Commandment number 4 is, does anyone remember roughly? Partially? You can go back to Exodus 20 if you don't. But what is the 4th of the 10 Commandments?
The Sabbath. Yeah, keep the Sabbath.
Remember it, yeah. The Sabbath day. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Can somebody go ahead and read for me Exodus 20, verse 8, 9, and verse 10? It's all wrapped up in this.
Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath day for us dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. You want to do 11 too?
Is that part of it? Then read it. If it is.
For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the 7th day he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy.
Okay, that's an important part. I'm glad you wrote that. Okay, that is a lot. When the 10 Commandments start, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make an image in the form of anything. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. But commandment number 4, the Sabbath, is kind of got a long explanation for it, right? 3 verses explaining what that command is. Interesting. So what is the Sabbath day? First of all, what day is it?
Saturday.
Saturday. Good answer. A lot of people make the mistake of assuming it's Sunday because that's when Christians tend to go to the church building, but it's not. It is Saturday. And there is no biblical such thing as a Christian Sabbath being a Sunday. That's kind of a man-made idea, but it's not in the Bible at all, so there's no such thing as a Christian Sabbath. Now, what examples do you have of the Sabbath in other ancient cultures? Well, not that many. None. It's interesting that the idea of, 6 days you'll labor and do your work, and the seventh, put those two together, is going to be a day of rest. That's kind of unique among the Israelites and in the Bible. You don't see a lot of examples of that. So this is kind of groundbreaking. Right off the bat, we need to establish something, though. This is in the 10 Commandments, and a lot of people assume mistakenly that, oh man, I need to obey all the 10 Commandments to be right with God. So what does the New Testament say about the Sabbath? Well, 2 important verses. One of them will go Mark 2:27. Mark 2:27. I'll need a reader for that in a second. Somebody can look that up. And then, just as important, Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 through 17. Who's got the Mark passage?
I have it.
Oh, thank you. All right. This is Jesus talking.
Yep. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath.
The Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. Yeah. So the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What's the idea of that?
It's meant to benefit us.
Yeah. So which is more important? The Sabbath or the people?
People.
Yeah, the people, right? Now, why would Jesus feel the need to express that? Do you remember the context here? Who's he dealing with, and what is their view of the Sabbath?
Religious leaders.
Religious leaders, and what do they think about the Sabbath?
You're not supposed to work or do anything.
They added a bunch of tradition to that Sabbath. They accused him, they said it was wrong for him to do miracles on the Sabbath. That's a little funny, right? Help someone get better, help save somebody's life. Oh, it's the Sabbath day. Now, Lacey read that whole thing about Sabbath rituals. Do you remember any of those? Or
Yeah.
I should have asked you ahead of time, but
Well,
what are some of the restrictions that the Jews later on developed concerning
well,
the
the reason
Sabbath?
they were mad about him healing was because it was physicians were prohibited from treating a patient on the Sabbath unless their life was in danger. They weren't even allowed to set a broken limb. They had to wait until after Sabbath.
Does that sound like
That's one of the things. but,
the Sabbath made for man there? Nope, sorry, it's the Sabbath. Can't fix it. Remember anything else?
Yeah, I'm trying to see. It was all these different things that were associated with things that men did for jobs, so that they couldn't, if you like, it's like digging, plowing, kneading, washing, those kind of things. And it was also a sin for a man to tie a knot, because of like normally fishermen and stuff. Except if he was tying a knot that could be undone with one hand, then it was okay.
One
Because
hand.
apparently one hand isn't working. And a
It's
woman,
exhausting.
yeah, a woman was allowed to
Think
tie
about
the
it.
strings of her cap, her girdle, or her shoes on the Sabbath. So if a man wanted something tied, two things tied together, he would have his wife tie her girdle to them because then she was just tying the girdle strings.
Good way around it.
I
Can't
don't know
work
what a
well
biblical
at a time.
girdle is. That just sounds kind of weird, but
Yeah, okay, so you have to have the girl tie the article of clothing or whatever together, and that'll count in order to get around it. Any others, or is that the gist of it?
I think it was basically like any sawing wood, driving nails, washing, anything. I think it said there was 39 primary works that were outlawed.
They added a lot to the Sabbath. There's another one that I don't remember correctly. Maybe one of you will remember it, but it has to do with if your house is burning down. You remember this? Your house is burning down, you're not allowed to cry out or something. I'm not going to get this right, but it's something to the effect of if your house is on fire, you can't go run. No, I know what it is. You cannot run and put out the fire because that would be work, and you cannot do work on the Sabbath day. But if you happen to see a Gentile nearby, and they would do stuff like this, see a Gentile and couldn't ask you to go do the work, but they could strongly imply, hey, by the way, see the smoke? House is on fire. I'm not allowed to do anything about it. They could get a Gentile, or I think a woman too, I don't remember.
Probably one of their slaves or something.
They could
Like
get
that.
somebody else to run over and put the fire out, but they weren't allowed to do it themselves. Yeah.
Didn't they circumcise on the Sabbath day?
On the 8th day, so that would actually make it, well, all babies are obviously born on Monday, no, on Sunday, right? What's the baby born day? I don't remember. No, they did it on the 8th day, so not necessarily the Sabbath day, but
I wonder if they would wait.
including the Sabbath day if it was, I think you're right, I think they probably would.
'Cause
Now, I don't know about traditionally later on, but
over in John, Jesus was chastising Pharisees for circumcising the Sabbath.
there you go. That sounds like work. That's a medical procedure, is it not?
Well, their version of what.
Yeah, okay. We're not going to get into that anymore. We're done with
And that, the one we just read is about when the disciples were plucking grain, and so they were against that because it was considered farming and harvesting. So you couldn't just take a couple of the grain off and eat them because you were harvesting.
Oh, and you're not
That's
allowed
why
to
it was,
harvest. And Jesus allowed his disciples to do that because that's Colossians 2, 16 through 17. This, if anyone tries to tell you that you need to follow the Sabbath today, this is the go-to passage, I believe. So somebody willing to read Colossians 2, 16 and 17.
So don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days, or new moon ceremonies, or Sabbaths. For these rules are only shadows of the reality yet to come, and Christ himself is that reality.
That's pretty specific. Paul says, don't let anyone judge you in regards to, and he lists feasts and festivals, or a Sabbath day observance. Why? These are a shadow of what is to come, but the reality is Jesus. So these are all leading up to Christ, he's saying, but nobody should judge you over that. And if someone is telling you you need to follow it, and if you don't, you're not right with God, that sounds kind of judgmental to me. It sounds like you are being judged over disobedience. And that's specifically what that verse says not to do, yeah?
So, when someone tells me that they observe all the feasts today, they're wrong for doing that?
I'm not saying
As
they're
a
wrong.
Christian?
The verse doesn't say they're necessarily wrong for doing that, but it does say, don't let anyone come to you and tell you need to do it. Don't let anyone judge you for that, because these are a shadow. The reality is in Christ. Christ is what matters, not these particular holidays. There's an order to it. There's principles we get here, but we have to start from the beginning here, and that is the Sabbath day observance is not carried over in the New Testament. The other commands basically are. They basically are, but the Sabbath one is pretty clearly changed. So why are we studying it? What are we supposed to learn from it? Well, principles, obviously. Principles. They're not just in schools, guys. They're everywhere, and they're important for us to learn. First, man is like God in the sense that what? God, for 6 days, did what? Worked on what? Everything. Yeah, he worked on everything. And then the seventh day, he rested. That doesn't mean he was exhausted. It doesn't mean that he, quit working in the sense of stopped overseeing creation or something. It says, the Bible says God's always working. But he stopped his creating. There's another little implication there too. We on strict Jew, even on the Sabbath day, yeah, you stop your work as far as your day job, the things that you were doing then, but it doesn't mean you don't do any work at all, because God's always working if you're going to follow God's example. Mankind, like God, is supposed to deliberately set aside time for work and time for rest, which hopefully we'll see that's more of family time. It's probably what the Sabbath day was about. It would force people to stay home and spend more time with their family, because they're not allowed to go out and do a lot of the field type jobs, not allowed to gather wood and gather food and all that stuff. So dads and slaves, everyone is spending time at home.
It's also part about taking care of yourself too, because like it says, it's for us. And anybody that knows a workaholic can go like 14 days and not stop, and that takes a toll on your body and mind and soul. How are you gonna focus on God and take care of yourself or your family if all you're doing is working and not taking a moment to just sit down? Yeah,
definitely. Now here's another thing. He didn't say 1 day you shall rest and 6 days you shall labor. He says 6 days you shall labor and then the Sabbath days of rest. Why say it that way?
You rest after the work is done.
You rest after the work. Is there some principle that we're supposed to gather from that? Well, the author of Ecclesiastes talks about this too. What happens when you've done all that work? Well, resting is so much better. Have you guys ever tried to, I guess I shouldn't say this because it might not be true for everyone, but I've had situations where I just want to be lazy, and so I commit to being lazy, to not doing anything. And what happens? After so many, hours, days, it depends on the situation, what I can get away with. It's not fulfilling. It happens, but the whole time, what are you thinking? I'm worried I'm going to have to do something. I know it. Somebody's going to catch me in my resting phase, and I'm going to get knocked out of this. I'm going to have to go get to work. And I'm kind of miserable the whole time. However, if I've just done a whole bunch of work, and then I sit back and relax, and everyone's pleased because they see a bunch of work has been done, you tend to be a little bit more satisfied. You can sit back and, what does the author of Proverbs say? When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Sounds good, right? So, yeah, the rest is earned from all that work, and you have to have both. Also, the Sabbath day was considered God's special day. It was a very special thing. It was almost like a gift that he was offering to his Israelites. Because they're living a hard life. I mean, got to be out in the fields. It's hot. They have to work. And so in a sense, God did them a big favor by saying, hey, this is a day of rest. Everyone, even the foreigners, are getting pulled into that. So there is no overworking somebody, you can't have them work on the Sabbath. They have to get a mandatory rest period. So God was helping out all of them. And then I guess the other principle would be, if work is important, the other side of this command, rest, is also important. And we Americans especially, and you were talking about this, we're good at emphasizing how important work is, but when it comes to getting a good night's sleep or just taking a little bit of rest, are we good at emphasizing the importance of that? Well, yeah, when it's somebody else and we're watching them burn themselves out, but when it's us, if you're a workaholic, you know, you just keep going. You're like, sleep, I'll do that later. I'll give me some drugs or something and keep going, right? And then your body gets sick and you have mandatory rest, and you know that's even worse a lot of the time. So rest is important, just like work is. They're both important. Comment, or you just?
I was just thinking of the proverb that says, like, a little rest, a little slumber, a little fully in the hands to sleep, and a thief will come.
Yeah, that's the guy who only rests and doesn't do any the lazy one.
No.
I don't remember
how
that you
exactly
can relate
is.
to. I think about that in the morning. I'm to the point where, a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. And poverty will overtake you like a bandit. A bandit, yeah. Scarcity like an armed robber. I think about that as I sleep. Now, here's something I didn't know. Maybe you didn't know it either. And then, cool, we learned something. The Sabbath day, this is what Doc Smith points out in his book, it was never a mandated day of worship. A lot of times it's assumed, because we hear about the assembly and we hear about stuff happening at the tent of meeting occasionally, we hear about these gatherings, we just assume that the Sabbath day was a worship observance that the congregation would come together and do. Now here's what's interesting. Yes, it was that way in the days of Jesus and beyond the days of Jesus when they had synagogues. The synagogues, every Sabbath day, people gathered together and they would study and read the law of Moses as they did on other days. So that tradition came, but the passage here, and I'll just write it for you, we don't have to read it, but the 2 Kings, I believe it's chapter 4, verse 23, if you keep that in your notes, that is the earliest reference we have to a worship type gathering happening on the Sabbath day. 2 Kings, that's going to put us where? Well, we're after the time of David now. We're after the period of the law given earlier, right? So that didn't happen till later on. A lot of people have confused that, and it's easy to just assume, oh, it's a Sabbath day. That must mean we stop and worship. No, it doesn't mean you stop and worship. You just stop. So what are you doing? You're probably spending quality time at home with the family. As a matter of fact, to make this lesson impactful, we should all just go home, shouldn't we? We should apply it, shouldn't we? Just kidding. Yeah, we'll do it later. It's not Saturday yet. Okay, so Sunday is not the Christian Sabbath. We already pointed that out. So we don't want to interpret that. We also don't want to confuse the idea that, oh, the Sabbath day must be a worship gathering. No, it doesn't mean it's that. It's primarily talking about the rest. So what are some practical reasons why God would want the Israelites to have this Sabbath day observance? Can you think of any practical reason why God would lay out this command other than what we've already kind of discussed? Anything come to mind?
Yeah. It was also put out as a time set aside for remembering God, really, and the things that He has, or the things that He did for the Israelites.
You're right. Now, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 5, what's in Deuteronomy chapter 5? The same thing, the 10 Commandments again. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. If you look, the Exodus 20 account, God says, in 6 days I created everything, the seventh day I rested. This is given at Mount Sinai. This is shortly after they left Egypt, real quick after. If you go to Deuteronomy 5, when it's a retelling of the law, Moses is recapping it, he changes it. And he's not talking about creation anymore. Instead, he talks about, you guys were slaves in Egypt, but God delivered you, and the Passover and all that. And so the Sabbath day was a remembering of being rescued from Egypt. Now, I don't know, I just find that interesting, why early on in the beginning they would just say, hey, here's this principle of 6 days, not really talking about Egypt, but then after the wandering and a bunch of people have died, everyone because the 40 years in the wilderness, that whole generation died. And Moses is giving the second law in Deuteronomy that he would point out, do this, remember this Sabbath day, because you were slaves in Egypt and God saved you. He kind of reassigns it a little bit. So, why? Why would he do that?
You say, well, all the adults are gone, so a lot of them were kids or didn't really know what being slaves in Egypt were. So.
That's an excellent point. You don't need a special reminder for people who just got out of there. You know, have any of you, I don't know, experienced a tragic event like a wreck recently? Have you been in a wreck recently? All right, maybe that's not a good example. But if you had, I don't think you need a reminder about how you were recently in a wreck, because you were in a wreck, you know what I mean? Now, it is different when you're by the highway and you see those drive safely signs and you realize, oh, I think somebody died there. Well, why did they put a sign there? Because I wouldn't have known. It wasn't my life or it was so long ago. But I guess I'm supposed to drive carefully because somebody didn't, you know. So that's a good point. This new generation didn't actually see the Exodus or may not even remember it if they were little kids. So they need a reminder that way. I'm also thinking too, in a real practical sense, the principle of rest. Why would God say it, you know, base it on creation in the beginning? Well, they're about to spend 40 years wandering the wilderness. I think having a day of rest when you're wandering in the wilderness all the time is an excellent idea. So that might also be another reason why he chooses in the beginning to lay out, this is a principle that even God himself demonstrated in the beginning. You know, he clearly doesn't need it, but he did it anyway. And then later on, he assigns it to, now let's use this to remember something else significant that you should never forget, and that is the Exodus from Egypt. So why should we remember the Sabbath day? Well, if you stop and think about that, were you and I ever delivered from Egyptian bondage? Have any of you been a slave in Egypt? No, not really. Now, in a spiritual sense, we were in bondage, yes, and we were delivered, for sure. But physically speaking, and as far as what the Sabbath was supposed to remind him of in Deuteronomy 5, that doesn't apply to us. We were never slaves in Egypt, so there's no real reason to hold on to the Sabbath the way they did, too. So that's just another practical reason. Definitely, this command helps out slaves, because they're the one people that you'd be tempted to, if you believe, let's say you're a good Israelite, you believe in a good work ethic, but also having great rest with your family, you could care less about your slaves. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. Especially if you came from other backgrounds, people mistreated them all the time. And so they would just be overworked. But if you came into God's territory, you're with God's people, even the people that committed to serve you for life, because slaves were set free, well, there's the big 50 years, and then there's the Sabbath rest too. Every so often, slaves were set free, and they could willingly decide to stay. But if you were a part of that, your slave could, every week, had to take a break. Everyone had to take a break. So that's a good practical reason too. How did this command get carried out? Well, did I write down reference for that? I don't think I did. Do you recall it was a man gathering firewood, and it was on a Sabbath day?
Naked stuff or something.
What they did is they gathered him up first, and they went to Moses, and they said, hey, what should we do with this guy? We found him gathering wood. You know, what should the punishment be? And they asked God, and God said, everyone kill him. Stone him to death. That seems awfully harsh, right? Now, this is a review, I know, but why would God give such a harsh punishment to people? I mean, the guy just was gathering firewood. How is it fair that God kills him for doing that?
He knew the rule.
Okay, he knew the rule, but we sometimes break God's rules and we know them, and yet God hasn't saw fit to allow us to be killed for it. Why? What's different with us that is different with them?
It was in the way that it was revealed to them.
Okay.
It was very direct, very apparent, and the punishment was very, very clear as to what would
Blatant
happen.
disobedience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And What did they see every day?
They saw the pillar of fire or in the cloud of smoke.
God was leading them in the wilderness, dropping their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and their water next to them, letting their clothes and shoes never wear out. God was hovering over them, helping them in a special way, allowing them to live. So, since he was extra close, and somebody still said, no, I don't care about you, God, I'm going to disobey, the penalty is more severe. Same principle applies to us, right? If we know better, but we willingly decide, no, God, I'm not doing the way you said, to whom much is given, much will be required. There's more required. So I think God's being perfectly fair because God is babying them along in so many other areas. He's not being unreasonable when he says, obey me exactly. I want you to take a rest. And if you don't take a rest, you're going to die. And I bet you that guy helped out a lot of other people. But a lot of other people were considering getting that wood that they forgot to gather. And they changed their mind because of what happened to old Joe Schmo, who died. All right, we're ready for Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. This moves us to the 5th commandment. I believe this is the only positive, that sounds bad to say positive, you know what I mean, right? This is the only, not negative as far as it's stated, but affirmative command given in the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. Somebody read verse 12, Exodus 20:12.
Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land and the Lord your God has given to you.
Honor your father and mother. Both. Not just one, both. So that what?
So that you may live a long life.
So that you'll live a long life. Are you suggesting there's somehow a correlation between honoring parents and living lifespan? Does the Bible suggest that?
Looks like it.
Goes back then.
Yeah, I think so.
Kill you if you disobey.
But you know what? Even in the New Testament, look at Ephesians 5 and Ephesians 6, first verse, and then after that. I believe Paul says the same thing, that it may go well with you, that you may live a good life. I believe that's Ephesians 6, where the first part where he talks about that. But the same thing is applied, that if you honor your parents, you're probably going to live, odds are you're going to live a longer life. Why would the Bible say something like that?
Because it's true.
Why is it true though? I mean, what would make that true?
Isn't it better?
If you're a troublemaker to your parents, you're probably going to be a troublemaker with everyone else as well.
Well, that's true.
And,
So somebody will kill you because they hate you
or
so
you
much?
could just get in trouble and be
That's a
doing
good
bad
point.
things.
That's a good point. Now let's flip it around. If you're, keep going. Yeah. You go.
Well, I didn't
No, I want to hear your answer to this too.
Well, it says honor your father and your mother, and it makes me think, well, if I honor God, I'm going to do what he says. I'm going to keep his commands. I'm going to try and live within his will. Well, the same would be true if you're honoring your father and mother. Hopefully they are bringing you up in the Lord, so if you honor what they've taught you, and
Yeah.
you're going to have a full, happy life.
So let's bring in Ephesians 6:1. Can anyone quote Ephesians 6:1? It's the very first verse I ever learned as a child. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Some people learn John 3:16 first, but not in my family. It's children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. It was the first verse everyone had to memorize, and so I do it with my kids too. That's verse number 1 right there. But don't leave out that little phrase, in the Lord. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And what does that cause? Well, if your parents are being godly, if you're obeying them when they're guiding you in the Lord, you probably will reap the benefit of a better life and maybe even a longer lasting one. Definitely spiritual benefits, but even physically speaking, someone who's wise enough to listen to their parents' advice and to not have to just go out and try it for themselves, you know, I hope because of what I did that somebody is not going to cut their arm off. Because I had to try something for myself. That was not a very smart idea, right? But there are some people that, I'm not listening to you. And if my kids are like that, I'm not listening to your experience with saws. I'm doing it my own way. Well, something bad might happen, right? So you can see how the principle would apply regardless. So, this is a good opportunity to talk about the Bible's view of authority. I believe it's Bob Russell that used the idea of spheres of authority, circles of authority. What are the authorities? Let's start up top. What is the ultimate highest authority that God has ordained in the world? Well, higher than that.
Himself.
Himself, yeah. We've got God is right up top. Now, after we have God, what's next? You said it.
Government.
Yeah, government. Just put rulers, same idea. We have God, then next comes, so God is over all, then we have rulers. Then what comes after the rulers? Specifically, what?
Dad.
Dad, okay.
Husbands.
Yeah, husbands. Yeah. Now keep in mind, this is not talking about spheres of importance, right? We're not talking about that. We're talking about spheres of authority, responsibility. That's what we're talking about. Husbands, then
Wives.
Wives. And then what's next?
Dogs.
Not
Dogs.
me.
Before you get to the dogs, I hope you have put another one in there. Yeah, let's put the kids in there somewhere. Now, some people, you know what? Our society has gotten to that point where some people do honor their dogs more than their kids. It's kind of sad, I think. But yeah, and then the animal kingdom we all have dominion over. But that's kind of the idea. God has laid out these ideas. We all are subject to the rulers. But if the rulers say something that goes against God, who are we going to follow? Always go to the top, right? Well, wives are supposed to submit to their husbands, but if the husband is going to try to get the wife to do something against God, or maybe even something illegal, should she do it? I'm going to suggest she shouldn't, because of the higher authority situation, right? And on it goes. Kid, down at the bottom. Down at the bottom. But that's okay, they grow
Seth,
up.
can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I was really convicted by what we were talking about. Was it last week? I can't remember now what the forum was, but talking about rulers. You know, I'm really having a hard time because I feel like our current ruler goes against God on so many levels.
Yeah.
And yet I'm
Yeah.
supposed to respect my ruler.
Yeah.
How do I?
How do you do
I'm
that?
really finding that emotion because I'm really angry.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand, but God put those rulers in place. It doesn't say that.
They still have the authority, yeah. That said ordained by God. And I don't know that it necessarily means that God's like, oh yeah, I want you. You look like a good president. Throw you in there. I don't think it necessarily means that, but God ordained the position.
Yeah.
He ordained the system. He said this is good. Or this is the way it should be. So in that sense, yeah. But you're right. What do you do if the rulers are in conflict with God? Well, you don't live a comfortable life, basically, right? You're all the time walking on eggshells. You're like, okay, am I breaking the law of the land or am I breaking the law of God? Don't want to do either, but, oh, looks like I have to do one. Which one am I stepping on today? Yeah?
I don't know why, but like every time we talk about this, I keep thinking of the Purge movies because I just like, I know it's like a drastic, huge, like really big example or whatever, but it's just like that kind of a thought, like when it goes over that boundary, like.
Purge movies.
Yeah, you've
It's
never
the one
seen
where
the
the
Purge movies?
Government implements a worldwide purge where
For
you
12
can, like,
hours,
kill
all
whoever you
crime is
want.
legal,
Oh, that's
including murder.
Interesting.
You haven't seen any of those?
Well, now I
gosh.
should not wanna watch
They
those.
are, and I honestly, in my personal
They
opinion, I
don't like
think that way. I think that's gonna be one of
Oh,
Trump's
man.
new laws.
But we know about the early Christians, right? The early Christians were under the Roman leadership, which Rome was way more liberal than we are today. Way worse, right? What do they say? Like, I don't remember if it's 13 out of 16. But like, it seems like 75% of the Roman emperors were homosexuals. So they're a step further down the road than we've been.
It wasn't
And
just that, they had multiple, like they celebrated it and they had a whole bunch of
Along with
Human
pedophilia, which
trafficking
is
of-
of course accepted, the norm or whatever. And they were supposed to be worshipped. You're supposed to say that Caesar is Lord. You're supposed to offer incense. And any citizen at any time is stopped and they have to do it. And several Christians wouldn't do it. And what happened? Well, they ended up getting killed. Why? Because they would not say Caesar is Lord, because only God is Lord. And they were so convicted that they said, hey, you are a ruler. You are over us. Jesus said, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. But Caesar is not Lord. He is not the ultimate master. He is not a God. So Christians wouldn't do it, and it caused them all kinds of grief. So we're really nowhere near that kind of thing yet. Well, hopefully we'll never have to live through that. Hopefully not. But yeah, this is not a new issue. It's been an ongoing issue that our ancestors have faced for a long time. And I imagine that's how we respond to it is part of our witness too, I guess. The things that we're willing to do that clearly don't always benefit us, but we're doing it because our allegiance is here, that's probably going to be a witness, ultimately, even if initially people think you're crazy. And I mean, I confess, I have a hard time with it too, because there are some things where I want to pull out principles in God's Word and say, oh, look, you rulers, you got it all backwards. But I got to be honest, I don't know that God's actually saying this. I'm just saying, oh, I think God's implying that I should have more freedom than what you crazy guys are giving me, and I should be allowed to do what I want to do here. And, you know what I mean? It's easy to rationalize something that's not necessarily there. Hopefully that makes sense. Hold up. So, does that mean, since kids are at the bottom and parents are above, that they have free reign? Because if they have authority, that means, yes, what do you want to do? Well, unfortunately, hate to break it to parents, but there are limits. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 18 through 21, make it clear that parents are not allowed to, number one, execute their children. You're not allowed to kill your kids. I know you say you're going to do it many times, but you're not actually allowed to deliver on that promise. All right?
There goes Friday night's plan.
Sorry, it is unbiblical. If, in case you needed a reference, we should probably clear that. You cannot kill your kids, even though you are an authority figure. Now, along with that, if you wanted to make it more religious-like, Deuteronomy 18:10. Second, you cannot offer your child as a sacrifice to some false god.
Molech.
Yeah. And we're not killing him, we're just offering him in a sacrifice where instantly he'll die. No, you can't do that either. You cannot do that either. Third, Leviticus 19 verses 29 through 30. Parents could not sell a daughter, now by extension this would be a son too, could not sell their kids into prostitution. I know you want to make some extra money, but you can't do it. That is wrong biblically. So you cannot pull the authority diagram out and justify prostitution with it, because God's Word made it clear even back then.
Leviticus what?
Leviticus 19:29 through 30.
Okay, thank you.
And this last one is not clearly stated, but clearly implied. Parents are not allowed to abuse children. Now in the New Testament, this is pretty clearly stated. It says, fathers, don't exasperate your children. You know, that would imply abuse as well. That's too much. But the way the rabbis figured this out is they used a command that was in Scripture, and that was the owner of a slave was not allowed to abuse his slave. He was not allowed to abuse it. Now, by extension, in their reasoning, and this would make sense, slaves are not as important as family, right? But if you are not even allowed to abuse one of your slaves, how much more are you not allowed to abuse your family, your kids? So, by extension, that implication is there as well. Now, Leviticus 19, verse 32 says some positive implication of this command. And so there are a few things that we need to kind of get in under the umbrella of family before we wrap up tonight so we can get through the fifth commandment here. Leviticus 19:32, can somebody read that for me? Your version might make it sound very interesting, but I want to hear what your version says.
19.
Leviticus 19, verse 32.
Stand up in the presence of the elderly and show respect for the aged. Fear your God, I am the Lord.
Stand up in whose presence? The elderly. They were commanded to show respect for the elderly, for the older ones, which, that's interesting.
My version just says stand up for the gray head.
That's a more literal translation. Stand up for the gray. So, could we extrapolate from that not just the elderly, but the stressed out parents that have already grown gray everywhere?
Or the whitehead.
It says gray card, not white.
Gray.
Anyway, yeah, so God's law said respect for all seniors, respect for all of them. Now, Leviticus 22:27 and Deuteronomy 22:6-7, those passages suggest that even animal parents, in other words, the animal dad, mom, whatever, of the baby animal, also were supposed to be treated with a certain amount of respect too. So by extension there, you could say, well, if that's how you're supposed to treat animals, obviously, you know, the way you're supposed to treat your kids are supposed to treat you. There's some obvious respect implied there, for sure. Let's read Leviticus 19 verses 2-3, because I think this is important. A couple of interesting things here. Who will read Leviticus 19, 2-3?
Give the following instructions to the entire community of Israel. You must be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Each of you must show great respect for your mother and father, and you must always observe my Sabbath days of rest. I am the Lord your God.
Okay. Each of you must show great respect for your mother and your father, and then he links it with the Sabbath. What does your version say? Great respect. More literally, what have we got?
Revere.
Revere, okay. You know what the word is? Fear.
Fear.
Each of you, you're supposed to fear, just like the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Well, beginning of wisdom, sorry. What does that mean in that passage? Well, obviously not just being scared to death of God, but having a strong respect for who God is and being scared of his power in a healthy way, right? A certain amount of fear is healthy for parents. It is the way the family, even under the Old Covenant, it's the way the family was designed. Interesting too, who's mentioned first? Fear who?
That was the mother and father.
Mother and father, not father and mother. Why say mother and father? Usually it's father mentioned first and mother, because we think of the spheres of authority. So why would he say fear mom and dad?
Because mom is the one that stays home and takes care of the kids most likely.
Okay, I think that's probably a good reason why. But you know another reason why, especially in that, what you know about that culture, what else might help you think why he would say mother and father?
Because usually women were not very important.
Yeah, women were not considered as socially important as men at that time. So if you got a son, he's growing up and he's a teenager, he's, you know, approaching manhood or whatever, the temptation would be like, okay, well, I'll do what dad says, but you're just my mom and you're a second-class citizen in this particular society. Not according to God's word, she isn't. So God's, and these are the little hints, by the way. A lot of people accuse the Bible of being sexist and everything, but you have no idea if you're not in the climate and in the situation. If you're trying to get a group of people out of a way of thinking that they've been entrenched in for hundreds of years and all the areas around them are, sometimes you don't do that by just saying, you're all wrong, leave your way of thinking now. Sometimes you do that by taking little baby steps out. And so God is coming in through Moses and through the law and is saying, honor your mother and your father. So that immediately says, oh, mom's more important than me. She has authority over me, even though she's a woman in this society. Yeah?
Leviticus 19:20 was the one about can't sell your daughter, right?
29 and 30.
Oh, 29, 30?
29
okay, sorry.
and
20
30.
was about female.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in that particular passage. That's why we keep referring to it. Let's see. Oh, Exodus 21:15-17 has the penalty for striking or cursing a parent. Either one, and we know what that was. Just take a wild guess. Death. Yeah. And last but not least, and this isn't exactly associated with family, but it's worth closing in, Deuteronomy chapter 17. This is in regards to the next sphere of authority up. When you get to the point where Well, let me let somebody read it. This is verses 14 through 20, so it's a little bit longer. Actually, I'll read this from the NIV Study Bible. Nearly inspired version, yes. Deuteronomy chapter 14.
Verses 17.
I'm sorry, yes, 17, verse 14 through 20. It's a bit longer. All right, it states, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it, that would be the promised land, and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. Now, he's talking about something that hasn't even happened yet, but later on, it is going to happen. So did God never want them to ever have a king? Apparently not. Apparently, there was a preparation for them to have a king, and Jesus is going to be ultimately come from the king. So, for the ruler that they had, this is a different relationship dynamic, obviously, but this is what it says about him. Then, in verse 16, the king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. Pause for a second. Is there a king of Israel that got horses from Egypt?
Yes.
There is. Remember who he is?
Solomon.
Solomon. And in case you wonder if Solomon might have made some mistakes, let's read this next verse. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Solomon, even though he was very wise, I think he knew better. I think he had the law, and he got carried away. And he violated some of these, and even the wisest man that ever lived.
What was the total count of how many wives he had?
How many?
10, isn't it?
Not quite, not that many. 700 wives.
700 wives.
300
concubines.
concubines, slave wives. Put them together, you have 1,000. You have 1,000. Yep. I think that qualifies for too many. I think that might be what he's talking about here.
You know, I think, I'm gonna double check,
Mhm.
but back in my King and I days, I did a lot of research on, the Fra, Nehemunguk, the guy that was the king at the time, and he had over 10,000 wives and concubines. That's who I'm thinking.
Wow.
Can you imagine?
Was that
Wow.
India?
No, I cannot.
Thailand.
That is crazy. Let me finish up. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, and taken from the priests who are Levites, it is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom Israel. So Solomon, even though he should have known this anyway, it commanded that the king should have had this law written down and read it every day. Solomon's daily devotions. Don't get too many horses. Don't get too many wives. Every day he's supposed to be, constantly supposed to be reading this. And he did it anyway. Isn't it interesting that right after Solomon, the kingdom splits? Isn't that curious? And yeah, Rehoboam was dumb, he's the next king. He made some mistakes, but it is clearly because of what Solomon did, because he violated the law. And he was not honoring his father, David. David, the man after God's own heart, was the one that was the great king, unified the kingdom and everything. And even though Solomon was wise, he ended up dishonoring his father, and he brought disgrace to Israel. Are there any questions about these two commands? Sorry I had to fly through them so fast. Gotta get back on schedule. Yeah.
What about that passage in Deuteronomy 21 about the rebellious son? That, who they, because he's rebellious, they picked him out and they stoned him.
Yeah, what about it?
Well, when you were talking about earlier about you're not allowed to kill your children.
Yes, you are not, but
It says
this
take
was a
them,
law.
it says take them to the court and have them decide.
Yeah. Now, under the law, all kinds of people sometimes took part in the execution. So it's sort of like, you know, in the electric chair situation, somebody throwing the switch or whatever. In a sense, are they killing them? Well, not really, but they're facilitating it or whatever. The penalty is being done by the rulers, or in this case, the theocracy. It's God's government, his system through Moses. But the people throwing the switch, or literally the rocks, would be the family and the others. Pretty bad. I mean, to get to that situation where somebody has lost control so much and rebelled so much that you have to do that. I'm sure that was like a very traumatic, very sad situation that it came. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
Is there any record of it actually being carried out?
Isn't that one right there?
No, it was.
Deuteronomy 21, 18 through 21. Didn't it actually happen there? I think it was commanded there, wasn't it?
It was a
Well, it
law.
says, suppose a man has a stubborn and rebellious son.
Oh,
So
it
it's like a
supposes it.
hypothetical.
You know what? You're right, it may not have ever actually been
Sometimes when we
recorded.
talk about
being
these
done.
laws, we're like, it seems really harsh, but there's no actual recording of it ever having to be carried out.
Man, I'm so glad you
But
pointed
just
that out.
in case.
But it's like, those are the standards, so people like you wouldn't necessarily do it.
That's a good way to scare kids, right? Scare them into obedience. The law allows you to die for that, so you shouldn't do it. Okay.
It also says
Works.
to kind of nail that in, it says all Israel will hear about it and be afraid. So,
For some people, that's even worse. All right, you guys remember Dad's illustration of the kid, the true story, the crazy kid on the airplane that mom's trying to keep him quiet, but he's out of control. He's like this little kid. He's a brat. He's just going crazy. And nobody could contain this kid, you know, and everyone's having a miserable flight. And finally, like an old, I don't know, old guy in the Air Force walks up to the lady and kind of says, hey, can I get involved here? Can I help? And the mom's like, sure, please, just take it, do something, you know, or whatever. And so he comes over next to the kid, and then he has like this wing badge thing or whatever, medal probably from his work, military. So he's talking to the kid, and all you see is him. He's pointing to his badge, he's pointing to the kid, he's pointing to his badge, and then the kid gets quiet, and then he goes back and sits down, and the kid behaves the whole rest of the trip. And did you remember when they asked him, what did you say? What did you say to that kid? He explained, I showed him my medal. The medal I got from all my years in the Air Force. And this medal allows me to take anyone that I want and throw them out of the plane.
Yeah.
Kids believed it. It worked. So, all right, let's go ahead and pray. God, thank you for what you've designed. Thank you for the family. Please help us to honor it, to honor our parents, no matter how old we are. Help us to honor you, of course, above all. And God, we do struggle with not getting the consistency right as far as we work too much or we don't work enough, and sometimes we just don't pace ourselves properly. So would you please help us to be mindful that we need to have time with our family, and we need to have time to rest and to appreciate, I guess, the fruit of our labor and what you've allowed us to enjoy even while we're here on earth. But God, thank you so much for heaven and what we're going to look forward to there. And we all thank you in Jesus' name.